A rescue cat stole bobcat cubs. What this cat did next made everyone cry. Elliot Parker stood on his porch on an early April morning, frozen in disbelief at what he was seeing. There, in the wicker basket where his cat Mabel usually napped, were two bobcat cubs, and curled around them, her white body wrapped protectively over their tawny fur, was Mabel herself. Her eyes were half closed, her pink tongue moving in slow, careful strokes across their small heads. The cubs were silent now, nestled against her belly, nursing beside the basket. Peach and Butter, Mabel's own 6-week-old kittens, sat watching with calm patience. Their usual feeding time had clearly been passed over. They looked like they understood something Elliot was only beginning to grasp. His hands were shaking as he pulled out his phone. These were the missing cubs from Silver Pines Wildlife Rescue, the ones that had vanished from the observation room just hours ago. The ones he and every staff member had spent the entire afternoon searching for, and somehow Mabel had brought them here, across 3 miles of forest and road, and claimed them as her own. "Andrew," he said when his former supervisor answered, "I found them. They're at my house, with Mabel." 20 minutes felt like an eternity. When Andrew finally pulled up with 2 other staff members, they all stood on the porch staring at the basket in silence. "I'll be damned," Andrew said quietly. The younger staffer, a woman named Lisa, cleared her throat. "Elliot, I know this looks wonderful, and Mabel is clearly incredible, but those are wild animals. Bobcats, even young ones, can be dangerous. To Mabel, to your own kittens, potentially to you. And they need specific skills to survive in the wild, eventually. This isn't sustainable." Elliot had known this conversation was coming the moment he'd seen the cubs. "I understand. We need to bring them back to the center tonight, before this gets more complicated." Elliot turned toward the door, his chest tight. As he reached for the handle, his hand brushed against something soft hanging from a hook on the porch rail, an old towel, cream-colored with faded blue embroidery. His wife Margaret had made it years ago when they'd first started fostering kittens at home, had stitched her name into the corner with patient precision. They'd used it to dry off wet or dirty rescues, had wrapped it around countless small creatures that needed warmth. He'd hung it there after she died 8 months ago. Couldn't bring himself to pack it away with her other things. His fingers closed around the worn fabric now, and something cracked open inside him. All those years, Margaret had poured herself into caring for animals that would eventually leave. All those goodbyes she'd smiled through because she understood that love meant letting go when the time came. She'd known something he was still learning, that the point wasn't keeping them, it was giving them what they needed. For however long they needed it, he turned back to face the staff. "Give me some time with them." "Elliot," Lisa started, "the cubs need a mother's warmth right now. Something we can't give them in a cage at the center. No matter how good our intentions. Let her nurse them, care for them, at least until they're stronger. I'll take full responsibility. I'll document everything." The staff exchanged uncertain looks. Andrew studied Elliot's face for a long moment, then glanced at Mabel, who was still curled protectively around all 4 kittens like this was the most natural thing in the world. 2 weeks, Andrew said finally. "We'll give it 2 weeks, but you document everything. Weights, behaviors, feeding schedules, any signs of stress or aggression from any of them. And if anything looks wrong, anything at all, they come back immediately." "Agreed." After they left, Elliot lowered himself carefully onto the floor beside the basket, his knees protesting. Mabel opened her eyes fully and looked at him with those steady yellow irises that had first caught his attention 4 years ago. In the kitchen, the coffee maker beeped. Forgotten. He reached out and gently stroked her head, feeling the vibration of her purr travel through all 4 kittens pressed against her. "Okay, girl," he whispered. "We'll figure this out together." 4 years ago, Elliot had met Mabel on a rain-soaked October afternoon behind the supply shed at Silver Pines. He'd been closing up for the day, wrestling with the rusted latch on the equipment room door, when he heard something that made him pause. Not quite a meow, more like a low, tired groan. He turned and saw her there by the dumpsters, a round white cat with mud streaking her fur. yellow eyes fixed on him with a look he recognized instantly after 3 decades of rescue work. Not fear, loneliness. He'd crouched down slow, ignoring his protesting knees. "You hungry?" She didn't run, just sat there in the drizzle under the narrow overhang, shivering, waiting, like she'd been waiting a long time for someone to notice her. He took her home that night, dried her off with that embroidered towel, set out food that she attacked like she hadn't eaten in days. He'd named her Mabel. It felt right, solid, dependable. The kind of name that belonged to someone who stuck around. That was before Margaret got sick, before the lung cancer diagnosis that came out of nowhere last summer, for months after her funeral. The house had felt like a tomb, just him moving through rooms that still smelled like her lavender soap, still held her reading glasses on the side table, still echoed with her absence. Mabel had stayed close during those dark weeks, sleeping on Margaret's side of the bed, following him from room to room like she knew he needed a reason to keep getting up each morning. Then 6 weeks ago, he'd found Peach and Butter in the laundry room, two tiny kittens tucked against Mabel's belly, mewling and perfect. His first coherent thought had been that Margaret would have loved to see this. His second thought was that maybe life was trying to tell him something about continuing on. Now, sitting on his porch floor beside this impossible scene, watching Mabel mother 4 kittens like it was exactly what she'd been meant to do, he felt that message coming through even clearer. That night, he decided to name the Bobcat cubs Ash and Cedar, both trees that grew strong in harsh conditions, that bent in the wind but rarely broke. He wrote the names in the notebook he'd started using to document everything. The first week was chaos in the best possible way. Elliot had raised plenty of kittens over the years, had bottle-fed orphaned fawns and raccoons and foxes during his time at Silver Pines. But this was different. Mabel nursed all 4 with seemingly endless patience, but the Bobcat cubs were wilder, more demanding. They cried louder, climbed earlier, tested everything with needle-sharp teeth and claws. What amazed him most was how Peach and Butter adapted. They seemed to understand somehow that their mother had expanded the family, that these strange spotted siblings needed extra care. Peach, the tiny calico, became a secondary guardian, staying close to watch over the bobcats when Mabel needed a break. She'd position herself between them and any perceived danger, her small body tense and alert. Butter, the orange tabby, was gentler, more playful. He'd pounce on the cubs carefully, teaching them the basics of roughhousing without ever using his full strength. Elliot sent weekly emails to Andrew with weights, photos, behavioral observations. Sometimes he added notes that weren't strictly scientific. Cedar keeps sleeping in the litter box instead of the bed. I've completely given up trying to correct this. Or Ash brought me a pine cone this morning and left it on my pillow. Pretty sure it was meant as a gift, though it's also possible he's plotting something. Andrew's responses were brief but encouraging. Looking good. Keep it up. Board approved another 2 weeks. On a warm night in early June, Elliot woke to a sound that pulled him from sleep. A low, distressed groan. He went downstairs and found Mabel in the living room with all 4 kittens pressed against her. Her breathing was labored, her eyes squeezed shut, her whole body trembling slightly. He dropped to his knees beside her, panic rising sharp and immediate. "Mabel? What's wrong, girl?" But as he got closer, checking her over with hands, he realized she wasn't sick. She was exhausted. The kittens had grown so much in just 6 weeks. They were heavier now, more active, nursing more aggressively. Caring for 4 was taking its toll on her aging body. He sat down on the floor and carefully lifted Peach and Butter, settling them in his lap despite their small protests. "Come on, you two, give your mama some space tonight." Mabel's eyes opened. She looked at him, then at the 2 bobcat cubs still nursing, then back at him. Her tail twitched once. "Thank you." Elliot stayed there until dawn, the 2 domestic kittens eventually settling into sleep in his lap while Mabel tended to Ash and Cedar. When the first light came through the windows, painting everything in shades of gold and pink, he felt something he hadn't felt since before Margaret got sick. Purpose, like he was genuinely needed again. not just going through the motions of living, but actually contributing something that mattered. The days developed a rhythm after that. Mornings on the porch with 2 cups of coffee, one for him and one placed on the small table beside the chair that used to be Margaret's. Mabel had claimed that chair as her own now, would spend hours there watching the kittens tumble across the yard, afternoons teaching them things they'd need to know. He showed Ash and Cedar how to bury food the way wild bobcats did, scratching at the dirt in the garden bed while they watched with intense focus, their small faces serious. He built a hunting simulator with ropes and old stuffed toys dangling at different heights, then laughed himself breathless when all 4 kittens attacked it like a coordinated military strike team. Peach was always the fastest, a calico blur. Ash was stronger but slower to react, more thoughtful in his approach. Cedar and Butter moved like they'd been planning strategies together, flanking their prey from both sides, every single morning without fail. Butter woke Elliot by licking his face. The rough little tongue on his cheek became more reliable than any alarm clock. It made him smile even on the hard days, the ones where he woke up reaching for Margaret before remembering she wasn't there. One afternoon in July, he found a small, round stone placed carefully in front of the screen door. It had tiny scratch marks on it, deliberate claw marks that formed an almost pattern. He picked it up, turning it over in his hand, then looked at Ash, who was sitting nearby on the porch railing with an expression that could only be described as enormously proud of himself. "You're a troublemaker," Elliot said, unable to stop smiling, "just like your brother Cedar." Ash made a sound halfway between a meow and the chuff of a wild bobcat. Elliot tucked the stone into his pocket. It stayed there for weeks, a small, smooth weight he'd touch sometimes when he needed to remember that good things could still happen. In August, Ash nearly died. Elliot had been doing laundry in the late afternoon, had left a basket of clothes in the hallway for just a moment while he went to switch loads. When he came back, Ash was on the floor gagging violently, a piece of thread from a torn shirt caught deep in his throat. His small body was convulsing, his eyes wide with panic and pain. Elliot didn't think, just moved. He'd performed the Heimlich maneuver on a choking dog once, years ago at the rescue center. He adapted it now, dropping to his knees and pressing carefully but firmly on Ash's small rib cage, angling the pressure upward. Once, twice. On the third compression, the thread came free in a wet tangle, and Ash gasped, coughed, then drew in a long, shuddering breath. For a moment, they both just stayed there on the hallway floor, Elliot's hand still supporting Ash's body, both of them breathing hard. Then Ash looked up at him with those welled amber eyes, and something passed between them, a recognition, a bond. From that day forward, Ash followed Elliot everywhere, into the bathroom while he shaved, out to the mailbox to get the mail, down to the basement when Elliot did repairs on the water heater. If Elliot sat down anywhere, Ash was in his lap within seconds. If he stood at the kitchen counter making dinner, Ash was there at his feet, watching his every move. "You've got yourself a shadow," Andrew said one afternoon when he stopped by to check on things and found Ash trailing Elliot from the room to room. "Yeah," Elliot said, watching Ash settle beside his feet the moment he sat down. "I guess I do." He didn't mind. There was something comforting about being needed that specifically, that completely. In September, Peach got herself stuck high in the big oak tree behind the house. She'd climbed higher than she'd ever gone before, had gotten caught up in chasing a squirrel, and now she was frozen on a branch at least 20 feet up. Her cries brought everyone running, all 4 kittens and Mabel converging under the tree. Elliot was heading to the garage to get his ladder when Ash simply scaled the trunk, nimble and confident, his claws finding purchase in the bark like he'd been doing this his whole life. He positioned himself on the branch right beside Peach and bumped his head against hers, done gentle but firm. Then he started backing down the trunk slowly, showing her the way, where to place her paws, how to grip with her claws, how to trust her body. She followed, hesitant and scared but trusting him completely, until they were both safely on the ground. Mabel had sat at the base of the tree the entire time, watching with that steady calm she brought to everything. When both kittens were safe, she looked up at Elliot, The expression on her face was unmistakable. See what they can do when we let them that night. Elliot sat on the porch with the journal he'd started after Margaret died. A way to talk to her when the silence in the house got too heavy. When he needed to hear her voice, even if it was just in his own head. He wrote about Peach stuck in the tree, about Ash's confident rescue. Then he added, they're teaching each other things I never could, not just survival skills, but how to care for each other, how to be brave when someone needs you. I think you'd love seeing this. Maggie, I think you'd say this is exactly what family is supposed to look like. By October, 6 months after Mabel had first brought the cubs home, Juniper appeared. Elliot was in the yard raking leaves on a cool afternoon when he saw movement at the tree line. Just a glimpse at first, tawny fur shifting through the shadows. Then she stepped into the clearing beyond his back fence, and he knew immediately who she was. The scars from the car accident were still visible on her shoulder and hindquarters. Her gait slightly uneven, but stronger than it had been. She stood there for a long moment, completely still, looking toward the house, on the porch. Mabel was lying in her usual spot with all 4 kittens sprawled around her in various positions of afternoon nap. She saw Juniper. Elliot watched her ears swivel forward, her body go alert. But she made no sound, didn't stand, didn't call out, just watched with those steady yellow eyes. After several minutes, Juniper turned and disappeared back into the forest as silently as she'd come. Elliot's heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. He thought about going inside for his phone, calling Andrew, reporting the sighting, but something made him stay still. Just observe, just wait to see what would happen next. That night, he sat with Mabel on the porch steps long after the kittens had gone inside. The October air was cool and sharp with the smell of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. She's looking for them, he said quietly, more to himself than to Mabel. Isn't she? She's recovered. She's remembering. Mabel's ears twitched. She stared out at the dark tree line, her body relaxed but somehow still alert, still listening. You brought them home when they needed you most, when their own mother couldn't care for them. But she's still out there, still alive. He scratched behind Mabel's ears the way she liked, felt her lean into his hand with a soft, rumbling purr. We always knew this day would come, didn't we, my girl? Over the following weeks, Mabel began to slow down. Nothing dramatic or sudden, just a gradual decrease in energy, a new stiffness in her movements when she stood up from napping, a reluctance to jump up on furniture she'd always loped onto easily before. Elliot took her to the vet, worried it might be something serious. But Dr. Morrison just smiled gently and said she was fine, just aging. That nursing 4 kittens for over half a year had taken something out of her, the way any demanding physical task would. Elliot started doing everything he could to make her more comfortable. He bathed her gently in the kitchen sink on days when she couldn't groom herself as thoroughly, talking to her softly the whole time. He changed out her bedding daily, making sure she always had the cleanest, softest spot near the fireplace. He made sure her food and water were always in easy reach, never on a high surface. For the first time since Margaret's death, he felt like a genuine caretaker again, not just going through the motions of keeping himself alive, but actively nurturing another living thing that depended on him. It gave his day structure, purpose, a reason to get up in the morning beyond simple biological necessity. He converted the spare bedroom, the one that had been Margaret's sewing room, into what he started calling the cat room. He built low platforms for climbing that wouldn't strain Mabel's aging joints, scattered toys everywhere, set up a large dog bed that all 5 of them could fit on comfortably. He hung a small wooden sign above the door that he'd carved himself in the garage one evening. The letters were rough but readable: Peach, Butter, Washi, and Cedar, the strangest siblings ever. Some nights, late when the house was quiet, he'd find all 5 of them piled together on that bed, a tangle of white and calico and orange and tawny spotted fur. Mabel always in the center, her 4 children arranged around her like the petals of some impossible flower. He'd stand in the doorway watching them, his throat tight, thinking about how Margaret had always wanted children, how they'd tried for years before accepting it wasn't going to happen, how she'd poured all that love into the animals they fostered instead. Maybe this was her way of giving him the family they'd always dreamed of, just not in any form he ever could have imagined. One evening in November, Elliot pulled out his old record player from the closet, something he hadn't been able to touch since Margaret died. She'd loved classical music, used to play it constantly while she cooked dinner, or worked in her garden, or sat on the porch with her needlework. He put on one of her favorites, Vivaldi's Four Seasons, and settled into his reading chair with a book he wasn't really paying attention to. Within minutes, all five cats had arranged themselves throughout the room, Peach on the back of the couch, perched like a tiny spotted guardian, Butter on the wide windowsill, his orange tail wrapped around his paws, Cedar on the rug near the fireplace, sprawled out in the warmth, Ash, as always, at Elliot's feet with his head resting on Elliot's boot, and Mabel in her basket beside the chair, eyes half closed in contentment. They stayed like that for the entire album, from the bright energy of spring through the languid heat of summer and the harvest celebration of autumn to the crystalline quiet of winter. None of them moved except to breathe, just listened. When the last notes faded into silence, Elliot looked at Mabel and found her watching him. "You've taught them to appreciate the finer things in life," he said softly. "Music, quiet, being together without needing to fill every moment with noise. I think Margaret would approve of that. I think she'd say you did good." Mabel. Mabel's tail twitched once. Her version of acknowledgement in the 9th month, late November, with the first real cold settling into the mountains. Juniper came back. This time she was much closer, just beyond the fence at the very edge of the yard, close enough that Elliot could see the amber of her eyes clearly. Mabel saw her from the porch where she'd been dozing in the weak afternoon sun. Something passed between the two mothers then. Some understanding or recognition that Elliot could sense, but not name or fully comprehend. Mabel stood slowly, her movements stiff but deliberate, walked to the very edge of the porch and simply lay down, watching, acknowledging, waiting. Juniper didn't approach any closer, just stood there, completely still, except for the occasional flick of her ear or twitch of her tail. For nearly an hour, then, as the sun began to sink below the tree line, she turned and vanished back into the forest. Elliot couldn't sleep that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind move through the pine trees outside his window, knowing in his bones what was coming, knowing it was right, even though it was going to hurt worse than anything he'd felt since losing Margaret. Around 2 in the morning, he gave up on sleep entirely. He went down to his workshop in the basement and found 2 small leather collars he'd made years ago for a different set of rescues that had eventually been released. He cleaned them carefully, conditioned the leather until it was soft again, adjusted them to fit Ash and Cedar's current size. Then he placed them in a wooden box lined with soft flannel fabric. He sat at his workbench and wrote a note on a small white card, his handwriting shaky in the dim light. "If you ever forget where home is, these carry the scent of the mother who first loved you." He brought the box upstairs as dawn was breaking and set it on the floor near Mabel's basket. She looked at it for a long moment, sniffed it carefully all over, then settled down right beside it. She stayed in that exact position all day. When Elliot came down the next morning with his coffee, she was still there, her white head resting on the edge of the box like she was keeping vigil. December came in cold and sharp. The first snow fell on a Tuesday morning, light flakes that melted as soon as they touched the still warm ground. Elliot was in the kitchen making his usual 2 cups of coffee when he heard it, a sound from the forest that made every hair on his body stand up. A chuff, clear and unmistakable. The distinctive vocalization of an adult bobcat calling. In the living room, Ash and Cedar, who'd been napping in a patch of sunlight, were on their feet instantly, their ears swiveled toward the sound, bodies going tense and alert in a way Elliot had never seen before. Something primal and wild flickering to life in their eyes. Peach and Butter looked at their bobcat brothers, then at each other. Then, without any signal or sound that Elliot could detect, they backed away slowly, giving space, giving permission, understanding what was about to happen. The 2 bobcat cubs moved to the screen door, their noses pressed hard against the mesh, their whole bodies vibrating with barely contained energy. Elliot's hand was shaking as he reached for the handle. He thought about all the mornings of waking up to find Ash curled against his chest, all the time Cedar had brought him gifts of leaves and pine cones, all the hours spent teaching them things, watching them grow. He opened the door. They ran, not hesitantly, not with any backward glance or moment of doubt. They just ran, their bodies low and fast and efficient, heading straight for the trees where Juniper was waiting in the shadows. Elliot stood in the doorway, gripping the frame so hard his knuckles went white. He watched Juniper emerge fully from the tree line, watched her approach the two cubs with careful steps. She lowered her head and sniffed them thoroughly, one then the other, relearning their scent. Then she began licking them with long, careful strokes, claiming them, recognizing them, finally becoming their mother in more than just biology. For a long moment, the three bobcats stood together in the light snow, a family reunited. Then Juniper looked back toward the house, her wild amber eyes meeting Elliot's across the distance. She held his gaze for several heartbeats, then lowered her head slightly. Not quite a bow, just an acknowledgement, a recognition of what he and Mabel had done for her children when she couldn't. Ash suddenly broke away from his mother and ran back to the porch at full speed. He bounded up the steps and went straight to Mabel, who was sitting just inside the doorway watching everything. He bumped his head against hers hard enough that she had to brace herself. Their foreheads pressed together for a long moment. She touched her nose to his very gently, a blessing, a goodbye. Then Ash turned and ran back to where Juniper and Cedar waited. The three of them disappeared into the forest together, Juniper leading the way with Ash and Cedar following close behind. Their spotted coats blended into the shadows between the trees until Elliot couldn't tell what was Bobcat and what was just patterns of light and dark. He stood there long after they were gone, the cold seeping through his shirt and into his bones, his breath making clouds in the morning air. Finally, he felt pressure against his leg. He looked down to find Mabel leaning against him, with Peach and Butter pressed close on either side of their mother. "They'll be okay," he said, his voice cracking and breaking. "You taught them everything they needed." Mabel made a small sound, barely audible. She ate very little over the following days. Elliot tried everything he could think of, different foods, hand feeding, warming her meals to bring out the smell. She'd take a few bites to please him. He could tell, but her heart wasn't in it. She spent most of her time on the porch now despite the cold, just lying in her chair, staring out at the forest, waiting for something Elliot couldn't give her. He held her one evening, wrapped in the embroidered towel that still smelled faintly of Margaret's lavender soap, and whispered into her soft fur, "You did something amazing, Mabel, something I've never seen in 30 years of rescue work. You gave those cubs a chance when they had no one else. You loved them without asking anything in return. That matters. That will always matter, even after we're all gone." Every morning after the cubs left, Elliot maintained the ritual he'd started back in spring. He'd step onto the porch with his coffee steaming in the cold air and call out their names. All four of them. Peach, Butter, Ash, Cedar. Peach and Butter always answered immediately with soft meows or by whining around his legs, demanding breakfast and attention. The forest stayed silent for weeks, empty of any response. Then one morning in late December, just as he was about to turn back inside, he heard it. A faint chuff from somewhere deep in the trees. He stopped, his coffee cup halfway to his lips, and listened hard. Another chuff, slightly different in tone and pitch. Two voices, two of his children, answering his call. Elliot smiled despite the tears running down his face, the cold wind stinging his cheeks. "Hey there, he called back softly. "Good to hear from you too. Stay safe out there." In January, Juniper appeared one final time. She came in the afternoon, moving slowly and deliberately across the snow-covered yard until she was just a few feet from the porch. No cubs with her this time. She wasn't calling for them or looking around. She lay down in the snow, her amber eyes fixed steadily on Elliot, who was sitting in his chair with a book forgotten in his lap. They stayed like that for maybe 20 minutes, neither one moving or making a sound, just being present together, acknowledging what had passed between them and what it had meant. Then Juniper stood smoothly, shook the snow from her coat, turned, and walked away. She didn't look back, didn't pause, just moved into the trees with that efficient bobcat grace and was gone. Elliot understood immediately. It was goodbye, a final acknowledgement. Her cubs were thriving in the wild where they belonged, and this chapter of all their lives was complete. That night, he opened his journal and wrote to Margaret. He'd started including photos recently, printed from his phone and taped carefully to the pages. Now he placed a picture he'd taken months ago. All four kittens asleep in a tangled pile. Mabel's white fur bright against the calico and orange and tawny spots. Under it, he wrote in his careful block letters, Maggie, do you see this after all these years, after everything we lost and grieved and survived? Our home finally had children, not the way we imagined when we were young, but maybe exactly the way we needed. Maybe this is what you were trying to show me all along. Years later, when people would ask him about Mabel and the Bobcat cubs, about what the local paper had started calling the miracle at Silver Pines, Elliot always gave the same answer. I don't believe in miracles, he'd say, looking them straight in the eye. I believe in love, the kind that doesn't ask who you are or where you came from or how long you're going to stay. Andrew commissioned a painting for the rescue center's main building. It hung near the reception desk where everyone entering would see it first thing. The artist had somehow captured that strange, beautiful family perfectly. And in the background, just barely visible at the tree line, Juniper watching over them all like a guardian spirit. People stopped to look at it every single day. Visitors, staff, volunteers bringing in new rescues. Some of them cried quietly, most of them smiled. All of them stood there longer than necessary, like they needed to absorb something the painting held. Some truth about what it meant to care for something you knew you'd eventually have to release. Elliot still lived in the same house, still woke up every morning and made 2 cups of coffee out of habit and memory and love. One for himself, one that he set on the small table beside what used to be Margaret's chair. Mabel had fully claimed that chair as her own now, would spend hours there watching the forest beyond the yard, her white fur bright against the dark wood. Sometimes, on quiet mornings, Elliot would sit with his coffee and talk to both of them, Margaret, and Mabel, the 2 constants in his life who'd taught him the same essential lesson in different ways, at different times, until he finally understood that love wasn't about holding on tight, wasn't about keeping things close and safe and unchanging. It was about showing up when you were needed, about giving what you had to give, whether that was care or comfort or just presence, and then, when the time came, about having the courage and strength to open your hands and let go. Elliot would close his eyes and just listen. To the forest waking up, to the silence between heartbeats, to the sound of Mabel's steady breathing beside him, and Peach and Butter playing somewhere in the yard. No words needed, just the morning. Just the knowledge that some families were chosen rather than given, no less permanent in the ways that actually mattered. And sometimes, if he listened very carefully on the coldest mornings, he could hear it, a distant chuff from somewhere deep in the trees, ash or cedar, calling back, remembering, letting him know they were still out there, still alive, still carrying everything Mabel had given them into their wild future. That was enough. That was everything. Every rescue begins with a heartbeat that refuses to give up. We're grateful you chose to listen to this one. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, a simple like or subscribe means the world to us.